Hey, Econ 200. This week we're talking about Chapter 5 of your textbook on the elasticity of supply and demand. Elasticity is basically a fancy way for saying how steep or flat is the supply curve and the demand curve. And that might sound like a trivial consideration, but it turns out that elasticity is very important when we're talking about empirical questions and when we're trying to think about the actual effects or the size of effects of different policies. So, for example, let's take a demand curve. And you are probably familiar with the US policy of drug prohibition, where lots of different chemical compounds in the United States are illegal for recreational use. Okay, marijuana used to be across the country, but now in more and more states it's becoming legal. But even so, we've got prohibition on, say, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine. There's any number of things that it's still illegal for people to use for recreational purposes. Same thing was true in the 1920s for alcohol, for example. All right, now you will have sometimes discussions, policy discussions about should we legalize maybe all drugs or should we legalize a particular drug? And one of the arguments on the side of legalizing drugs will often be people are going to use the drugs anyway. So prohibition doesn't stop people from using drugs. There's still black markets. All right, well, demand curves help us to think about the effect of a policy like prohibition on the use of drugs. So you've got a demand curve for, could be cocaine, could be methamphetamine, or it could just be all controlled drugs simultaneously. And what our demand curve tells us is the higher the price of these goods, the lower the quantity of units demanded. Okay, now when you have no policy of drug prohibition, that's going to result in a relatively low price of the good. I'm not going to draw a supply curve, but essentially what's happening is when drugs are legal, you would expect the supply to be fairly low and to the right. Okay, it's going to be comparatively cheaper to provide goods when you don't have to provide drugs when you don't have to break the law to do it. Okay, so in a world where there was no drug prohibition, maybe the price would be here. Call that price 1. Quantity demanded would be at Q1. And now what happens? Well, if you impose drug prohibition, that's going to shift the supply curve up and to the left, because if you're arresting people, for example, for selling this product, well, that means it's going to be a little bit more expensive, at least a little bit more expensive to provide it. People are going to have to hide their activities. They're going to have to just do business on black markets and generally with criminals. And so they're not going to be as efficient at producing these drugs as a legitimate company would be. So that supply curve shifts to the left. As it does so, that's going to drive the price up. And maybe drug prohibition is able to increase the price to, let's say, this level here. Okay, we'll call that price P2. You get that quantity of units consumed Q2. All right. So the opponents of drug prohibition do have a point where, yes, if you raise the price and you have drug prohibition, people are still using the drugs, right? So Q2 is not zero. There's still a positive number of people using them. However, people in favor of drug prohibition also have a point insofar as raising the price through prohibition does reduce the quantity of units demanded. So you probably get less drug use as a result of prohibition than you would if all drugs were legalized. And a big part of whether or not drug prohibition is worth it is how big is this reduction in the quantity demanded. Okay, and that reduction is going to depend on how steep is this demand curve. If the demand curve is very steep, you're not going to get a very large decrease in quantity demanded, even with a large increase in price. Whereas if the demand curve for drugs is very flat, then raising the price by even a small amount could get a large reduction in the quantity of units demanded. So elasticity of demand, even though it sounds maybe a little esoteric, or when you know that it's just kind of shorthand for how flat or steep this curve is, might sound trivial, it turns out it has significant real world impacts. So let's talk a little bit more about elasticity. It's generally the case that for any product that that producers want to sell, the demand curve for that product is going to be downward sloping, which just means the cheaper the good, the more units consumers want to buy, and the more expensive the good, the fewer units consumers want to buy. But not every demand curve has to be shaped exactly the same way. You could have demand curves that are quite flat, like this one. You could have demand curves that are quite steep, like this one. The one on the left, we would say that consumers are very responsive to changes in the price. How are they responsive? Well, change the price by a fairly small amount, and you get a large reduction or a large increase in the quantity of units demanded. So at this price P2, well, actually, let's start at P1. If I've got a price P1 on this more responsive demand curve, I draw that line over to the demand curve, and I get a relatively low quantity of units demanded, Q1. Now, what if I cut the price? If I cut the price down to P2, given this demand curve, I'm going to get a very large increase in the quantity of units demanded. Call that Q2. Okay? So that's a very responsive demand curve. In other words, the customers are really paying attention to prices here. If prices change by just a little bit along this demand curve, you can get big swings in the number of units that consumers want to buy. Okay? On this other side over here, we've got an unresponsive demand curve. So for this one, take the price P1, draw that curve, that line over to the demand curve. We get this quantity of units, Q1. Take the second price, P2. And it only increases the quantity demanded by a pretty small amount. Okay. Now notice that I measured these prices out ahead of time, so the distance between P1 and P2 is the same on this unresponsive demand curve as it is on this more responsive demand curve. So same change in price, but a much smaller quantity demanded change. Okay. Now, the term that economists use to refer to a demand curve that's very responsive is we say that demand is elastic. Demand is very elastic between these 2 points on the demand curve. And if a demand curve is unresponsive, or if consumers along the demand curve are unresponsive, we say that demand is inelastic between those 2 points on the demand curve. Okay? Elastic or more responsive demand curves would be demand curves for things like a brand name soda. Okay, brand name soda, it's very easy to find a substitute or a replacement. If the price of Coca-Cola goes up, you can easily buy Pepsi or RC Cola or the store brand of cola. Okay, so consumers tend to be pretty responsive to changes in the price because they can get a close substitute for any particular good just by buying a competitor. Or another example of a demand curve that's probably relatively elastic would be something like the demand for ocean cruises, right? So a cruise is a luxury good, and if the price goes up, it's not very difficult for consumers to say, I'm just going to do something else with my money instead. I wanted to go on vacation on a cruise, but those have become more expensive. So maybe I'll do something else. Maybe I'll drive to the Grand Canyon, or I'll go visit relatives, or I'll do something else instead. Inelastic demand curves tend to be for goods where the good is maybe something like a necessity, like gasoline if you're living in Southern California, if you want to get around, if you want to be able to take the kids to school, get to your place of work, do shopping, you pretty much have to own your own car. We have very poor public transportation. And so we're not very responsive to changes in the price of gasoline. All right. And so just relatively small changes in the quantity of units demanded can reflect very big changes in the price. So when the price of gasoline goes up by $1 a gallon, if there's some big shortage, maybe there's a refinery goes down in California, and so we can't import gasoline very quickly to make up that gap, you'll see prices spike very quickly. During the COVID-19 shutdowns, what we've seen is the opposite. There's been a big drop in prices, even though the quantity demanded of gasoline hasn't changed all that much. People are still doing a pretty similar percentage of driving as they were before COVID, but prices have been considerably lower than they used to be. Now, the term elastic and inelastic, the basic mental image that it should be bringing up with you is the idea of like a rubber band or a waistband of say, like underwear or sweats. If something is very elastic, you don't have to put a lot of pressure on it to get it to expand quite a bit, right? It doesn't take a lot of pressure to stretch out a very elastic waistband. But if something is very inelastic, it requires lots of pressure to get even a small amount of movement in that, say, waistband or rubber band. Well, the same idea is going on here with demand curves. An elastic demand curve, you don't have to push on prices very much. You don't have to put a lot of price pressure on consumers to see a large change in their behavior. But with an inelastic demand curve, for any given amount of price pressure, you're not going to see very much change in quantity demanded. All right, so that's the basic idea of elasticity. And in the next video, we'll talk about how you can measure elasticity and how economists calculate it.